What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets late-night television's sharpest tongue, and the conversation takes a turn that nobody saw coming? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had audiences gasping and network executives scrambling for damage control. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the moment when Sylvester Stallone, the man who brought Rocky Balboa to life, showed everyone that some fights happen outside the ring. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're going to want to discuss this one. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. The audience, packed with tourists and locals lucky enough to snag tickets, chatted excitedly as they waited for the cameras to roll. Tonight's guest was a big one, Sylvester Stallone, promoting his latest project and ready to charm the crowd with stories from his legendary career. At least, that's what everyone expected. "Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvester Stallone," Jimmy Kimmel announced with his trademark grin, gesturing toward the curtain as the band played, and the audience erupted in applause. Stallone emerged, looking every bit the Hollywood icon in a sharp black suit, his signature swagger intact despite being in his 70s. He waved to the crowd, that familiar smile spreading across his weathered face, as he made his way to the guest chair. The applause was thunderous, a testament to decades of beloved characters and unforgettable movies. "Sly, welcome back to the show," Jimmy said, extending his hand for a firm handshake as Stallone settled into the chair. "It's always great to have you here." "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Stallone replied, his voice carrying that distinctive gravelly tone that had become iconic. "Good to be back." "Now I have to ask," Jimmy began, leaning forward with the kind of mischievous expression that regular viewers knew meant trouble. "I was reading some of your old interviews, and I came across something interesting. You once said that you wrote the entire first Rocky script in 3.5 days. Some people are saying that's impossible." The audience chuckled, expecting this to be typical late-night banter. Stallone's expression shifted slightly, the easy smile becoming more guarded. "Well, Jimmy, when you're broke and desperate, you'd be amazed what you can accomplish," Stallone said, his tone still light but with an edge that wasn't there moments before. "I was literally down to my last few dollars. I had to write that script or I wasn't going to eat." Right, Jimmy nodded, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But 3.5 days for a complete screenplay? I mean, that's what, maybe 10 hours of sleep total?" "I didn't sleep much during those days," Stallone replied, his posture straightening. "When you have a vision, when you have something burning inside you that you know needs to get out, you don't worry about sleep. You just write." The audience was still with them, laughing at the appropriate moments, but there was an undercurrent of tension that the more perceptive viewers were beginning to pick up on. Jimmy's questions weren't just friendly curiosity, they had a probing quality that suggested he was going somewhere specific with this line of inquiry. "See, here's the thing that's bothering me," Jimmy said, pulling out a piece of paper from his desk. "I actually did some digging, and I found some old articles from back then. There are some people who were around during that time who remember things a little differently." Stallone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of people?" "Well, for instance," Jimmy continued, clearly enjoying the moment, "there's a guy named Charlie Thurman, worked as a script reader at the time. He says he remembers seeing early drafts of Rocky floating around months before you claim you wrote it." The studio audience had gone quieter now, sensing the shift in energy. What had started as a typical celebrity interview was becoming something else entirely. Stallone leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "Jimmy, I don't know who this Charlie Thurman is, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that I wrote Rocky. Every word, every scene, every piece of dialogue came from my head and my heart." "I'm not saying you didn't write it," Jimmy said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying that maybe the timeline isn't as dramatic as the legend suggests. Maybe it took a little longer than 3.5 days." "The timeline," Is exactly as I've always said it was, Stallone replied, his voice now carrying a harder edge. I wrote that script because I had to. Because it was the only way I was going to survive in this town. Jimmy sensed he had struck a nerve. And like any good talk show host, he pressed further. But come on, Sly, don't you think it's a little convenient? The broke actor who writes the perfect underdog story in 3 days and becomes a superstar? It's almost too Hollywood, even for Hollywood. That's when Stallone's famous temper, usually kept carefully in check during public appearances, began to show. His eyes narrowed, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. But there was steel underneath. Jimmy, I've been in this business for 50 years. I've taken punches, literally and figuratively, that would have knocked most people out permanently. I've been counted out more times than I can remember. So when I tell you that I wrote Rocky in 3.5 days, that's not a convenient story. That's not Hollywood mythology. That's the truth. The audience was completely silent now, the usual rhythm of late-night television completely disrupted. Jimmy, to his credit, didn't back down. Look, I respect everything you've accomplished, Jimmy said. But as someone who's been in entertainment for a while, I know how these stories get embellished over time. Details get fuzzy, timelines get compressed. Are you calling me a liar? Stallone interrupted, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly everyone in the room understood that this had moved far beyond typical talk show territory. Jimmy's smile faltered for just a moment, the weight of Stallone's direct question hitting him. The studio had become so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras, the soft breathing of 300 people holding their collective breath. I'm not calling you a liar, Sly, Jimmy said carefully, trying to regain his composure. I'm just asking questions. That's what I do. No, that's not what you're doing, Stallone shot back, his voice rising slightly. What you're doing is trying to tear down something that means everything to me, something that saved my life. For what? A few laughs? A viral moment? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy's sidekick, Guillermo, shifted, uncomfortably in his corner, and even the band members looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This wasn't playful celebrity roasting. This was something much more serious. Sly, come on, Jimmy said, attempting to lighten the mood with a nervous laugh. This is just a conversation. I'm not trying to tear anything down. Then why are you questioning the most important moment of my career? Stallone demanded. Why? Are you sitting there with your little piece of paper, acting like you've uncovered some conspiracy? Jimmy glanced down at the paper in his hands, suddenly seeming much less confident about his research. I just thought it was interesting. Interesting? Stallone repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You think it's interesting to suggest that my life's work is built on a lie? You think it's interesting to imply that I'm some kind of fraud? The audience was completely captivated now, witnessing something they'd never seen before. This wasn't scripted, this wasn't rehearsed. This was real emotion erupting in real time on live television. That's not what I'm saying, Jimmy protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what are you saying? Stallone pressed, leaning forward in his chair. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you're saying I'm a liar. It sounds like you're saying that the most difficult, most desperate time of my life was just a publicity stunt. Jimmy tried to regain control of the interview, clearing his throat and straightening his tie. Look, maybe we should move on to talking about your new project. No, Stallone said firmly. We're not moving on. You started this conversation. Now let's finish it. You want to know about those 3.5 days? Let me tell you about those 3.5 days. The camera operators were frantically adjusting their angles, knowing they were capturing something extraordinary. In the control room, producers were probably having heart attacks, but nobody was cutting to commercial. I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Hell's Kitchen, Stallone began, his voice now steady but intense. I had $11 to my name. $11, Jimmy. I'd been rejected by every agent, every casting director, every producer in this town. I was nobody. I was nothing. Jimmy opened his mouth to interject, but Stallone held up a hand, silencing him. I went to see the Ali versus Wepner fight, and I watched this unknown fighter go the distance with the greatest boxer who ever lived. And something clicked. I saw myself in that ring, not as a boxer, but as that guy who just needed one shot, one chance to prove he belonged. The passion in Stallone's voice was unmistakable. The raw emotion of someone defending something sacred. To them, I went home that night and I started writing. Not because I had some grand plan, not because I was creating a Hollywood myth, but because I was drowning and that story was my life preserver. I wrote for 18 hours straight, slept for 4, and wrote for 18 more. I did that for 3.5 days because I knew that if I didn't get this story out of my head and onto paper, I was going to die in that apartment. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even Jimmy seemed moved by the raw honesty of Stallone's words. When I finished that script, Stallone continued, I had blisters on my fingers from the typewriter keys. My back was killing me from hunching over that desk. But I had something, Jimmy. I had something that was mine. Something that came from the deepest part of who I was. Jimmy shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Sly, I appreciate you sharing that. No, you don't, Stallone interrupted. Because if you appreciated it, you wouldn't have sat there with your little gotcha moment, trying to make me look like a fool. You wouldn't have tried to turn the most important thing I've ever done into some kind of joke. The audience was completely silent, some of them looking genuinely uncomfortable. This had gone far beyond entertainment into something much more personal and painful. I never meant to make it a joke, Jimmy said quietly. Then what did you mean? Stallone asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you brought me on this show under false pretenses. You made me think this was going to be a friendly conversation about my career, and instead you ambushed me. Jimmy's face was flushed now, beads of sweat visible on his forehead under the studio lights. I was just trying to have an interesting conversation. By questioning my integrity, Stallone shot back. By suggesting that my life story is fabricated? That's what you call interesting? The confrontation was escalating beyond what anyone could have imagined. Jimmy was clearly out of his depth, facing a man who had built his entire career on fighting back against impossible odds. You know what the real problem is here, Jimmy? Stallone said, his voice now dangerously quiet. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. You've never been desperate, never been hungry, never been told that you don't belong. So when someone like me tells you about what real desperation feels like, you think it's entertainment. That's not fair, Jimmy protested weakly. Fair? Stallone laughed bitterly. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that you invited me onto your show just so you could try to humiliate me in front of millions of people? Is it fair that you're trying to destroy something that means everything to me for the sake of ratings? The band leader was making subtle hand signals to someone, off camera, probably trying to figure out if they should start playing to end the segment. But this was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. I think maybe we should take a break, Jimmy said, his voice strained. No, Stallone said firmly. We're not taking a break. You started this fight, and now you're going to finish it. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Jimmy's face had gone pale, and you could see him frantically trying to figure out how to salvage what had become a complete disaster. But Stallone wasn't done, not by a long shot. You know, what really gets me, Jimmy, Stallone continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of decades of frustration. I've been doing interviews for 50 years. I've sat in chairs just like this one thousands of times, and I've always been respectful. Always been professional. But you decided that tonight was the night to try and make me look like a fraud. Jimmy attempted one more time to regain control. Sly, I think there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Stallone interrupted, his voice rising. The only misunderstanding here is that you thought you could push me around. You thought because I'm older now, because I'm not the guy who was throwing punches in movies, that I'd just sit here and take it. The camera was capturing every moment, every micro-expression, every bead of sweat. This was the kind of television that people would be talking about for years. You want the truth about Rocky? Stallone said, standing up from his chair. The truth is that script saved my life. Not just my career, my actual life. Because without it, I would have ended up just another failed actor sleeping on park benches and begging for spare change. Jimmy remained seated, looking up at Stallone with what could only be described as fear. "Sly, please sit down." "Don't tell me to sit down," Stallone snapped. "You don't get to invite me onto your show, attack my integrity, and then tell me to sit down. That's not how this works." The audience was transfixed, some of them pulling out their phones despite the no-recording policy. They knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Every word of that script came from my soul," Stallone continued, pacing now behind his chair. "Every line of dialogue, every scene, every emotion. I poured everything I had into those pages because it was the only way I knew how to survive. And you want to turn that into some kind of parlor game." Jimmy made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Look, maybe I approached this wrong. Maybe?" Stallone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe you approached this wrong? You think maybe questioning a man's life work on national television might be the wrong approach?" The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the cameramen seemed to be holding their breath. "I'm going to tell you something, Jimmy, and I want you to listen carefully," Stallone said, moving closer to the desk. "I've been knocked down more times than I can count, in movies and in real life. But I always get back up. Always. And right. Now you're the one who's been knocked down." Jimmy's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his water glass. "I never meant to—" "You never meant to what? Hurt me? Embarrass me? Destroy something that's sacred to me?" Stallone's voice was like thunder now. "Well, congratulations, because you succeeded." The tension had reached a breaking point. You could feel it in the air, in the way everyone in the studio was holding their breath, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. "You know what the difference between you and me is, Jimmy?" Stallone asked, his voice suddenly becoming deadly calm. "When I get knocked down, I write a movie about getting back up. When you get knocked down, you just make jokes about other people's pain." That was the moment Jimmy seemed to realize he had pushed too far. His face crumpled, and for a second, he looked like a child who had just been scolded by his father. "I think I should go," Stallone said, removing his microphone and placing it carefully on the chair. "This isn't what I signed up for, and frankly, it's not what your audience deserves either." "Sly, wait!" Jimmy called out, but there was desperation in his voice now. "We can work this out." "Work what out?" Stallone replied, turning back to face him one last time. "The fact that you ambushed me? The fact that you tried to humiliate me on live television? What exactly are we working out? Here?" The audience was completely silent, watching this legendary figure prepare to walk away from what had become a train wreck of epic proportions. "You want to know the real story behind Rocky?" Stallone said, his hand on the curtain that led backstage. "The real story is that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, you find everything you need to win. But you wouldn't understand that, would you, Jimmy? Because you've never had nothing." And with that, Sylvester Stallone pushed through the curtain and disappeared, leaving Jimmy Kimmel sitting alone at his desk, staring at an empty chair and 300 stunned audience members. Jimmy tried to recover, clearing his throat and attempting his usual smile. "Well, that was unexpected. We'll be right back after this commercial break." But everyone knew there was no coming back from what had just happened. In the span of 20 minutes, what should have been a routine celebrity interview had become the most explosive moment in late-night television history. The confrontation between these two entertainment giants had revealed something raw and real about the price of fame, the power of dreams, and what happens when someone tries to tear down what another person has spent a lifetime building. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen anything like this on late-night television before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable stories from Hollywood's most shocking moments.